Well, look, nice to meet you all again. I am in a bit of a dilemma about this talk because I think I've spoken at least twice, possibly 3 times.
But so much changed.
The Trinity in Japan. Yeah, but that's the problem, Gerhard, about the Ukrainian crisis. The problem is, if I was an expert on contemporary Russian politics or on war or et cetera, or even if I was just in an IR department, I would be able to talk knowledgeably and with new ideas about what is actually going on. Actually, I'm a historian, and the extent to which I can add something is by putting the whole context, the whole crisis in historical context. The trouble is I've already done that twice or 3 times. I don't want to just repeat myself. So, I mean, this talk is a bit of a dog's breakfast, a bit of a compromise. I will still try to put things in context, but in a way which is somewhat different to anything I've done before. And I will also talk briefly about some developments and possible future developments, and then basically shut up and hope we can have a discussion. Okay. As I think I said before, the only time when I was, if not primarily, then greatly focused on contemporary politics was the last 8 years of the Soviet Union, when I was teaching in the politics department at LSE, but more to the point, I was, for all sorts of strange reasons, on Margaret Thatcher's Foreign Policy Advisory Committee and on a senior intelligence and security committee. And I was writing endlessly in the press and doing interviews. And actually, I've been sitting, particularly since I bust my arm, looking at some of the stuff I wrote then, sort of trying to remember some of the drama of those events. Again, think in the context of this evening, my most interesting memory is a lunch I had, there were about 5 of us, with Douglas Hurd, who was then the Foreign Secretary, early-ish in 1990, at just the moment when the elections to the Republican parliaments in the Soviet Union were taking place. And this was a lunch just after the Ukrainian vote. And therefore, most of the lunch was actually devoted to contemplating the possible disintegration of the USSR. Remember that the previous year you'd seen the disintegration of the informal empire in Eastern Europe. I mean, the first thing we were talking about were the dangers of some kind of KGB military hardliner Communist Party putsch. I mean, the obvious point being that most armies in the world, faced with the actual disintegration of the state, of the territorial state, not just the fall of a regime like the communist one, would probably intervene. As I think I may have said to you before, even the Indian army, absolutely horrified at the idea of involving itself in politics, would not, I think, stand aside if the actual Indian Union looked as if it was about to disintegrate. So that was one fear, that the looming threat of secession and disintegration would bring about a putsch. I mean, I still, to this day, am less surprised by what's going on right now than by the fact that the people who are staging this coup now, in other words, the top KGB military people staging this invasion now, didn't do it back in 90 to 91, or at least when they did were so ineffective. It's an interesting conundrum. But also, of course, with Douglas Hurd, unlike most contemporary British ministers, you could talk quite interestingly about history and its implications for the present. And of course, one thing that we talked to Douglas Hurd about was the collapse of the British Empire, the Irish crisis, which was very meaningful to him, since the Tory leadership had almost been blown up by the IRA only a couple of years before. And using this as a way to think about possible developments in the former Soviet Union. And one obvious point to make was that if less than 1 million Ulster Protestants and less than 2 million Pieds Noirs in Algeria could cause the chaos that they had caused, what about the implications of 25 million Russians being left beyond the borders of the USSR. And of course, that immediately focused you on the Ukrainian issue, since much the biggest group of Russians, or certainly the biggest, there are huge numbers in Kazakhstan as well. And that, thank God, is a crisis which has not emerged over the horizon, at least yet. But the largest number of Russians, ethnic Russians, were in Ukraine. And it was obvious enough that the Russian-speaking population, particularly of the Donbass and even more of Crimea, was going to be a major problem if incorporated into an independent Ukraine, if forced, to essentially wave goodbye to Russia. I mean, it was not inevitable, nothing was inevitable, but the risk was obvious. And of course, it's now come home to roost. We talked about Ukraine and Scotland because this was the traditional comparison, and in some ways not a bad one. The obvious point to make there was that, no Englishman thought that the English monarchy and the English church, English religion, began in Scotland for the obvious reasons that they didn't. But of course, the Russian monarchy and Russian orthodoxy did begin, in inverted commas, on territory which was now Ukrainian. And beyond that, and actually more important in many ways, is the fact that no Englishman ever denied that the Scots were a separate nation, people. Whereas for many Russians, and Putin is not that exceptional, certainly in the older generation, Ukrainians are a branch of Russians. It's a bit like a home counties person thinking about Yorkshire or Newcastle, Northumbria or something. That's not for a minute to say that's correct. It's merely to say that Putin's perception was very widely held among Russians, as I say, particularly the older generation. I mean, when I was involved in day-to-day politics, writing for the press, talking to the government, etc., and the security people, my real task was, as always, to put Gorbachev, put perestroika in some kind of broader historical context, which above all meant a Russian historical context. And the way I did this was to talk about 3 cycles of modernization in modern Russian history, by which I meant Russian history from the 17th century to now, or to then, to the 1980s, 90s. 3 cycles of modernization, all initiated from above by the state, all designed to make Russia, or keep Russia, a great power in a world dominated by the West. First cycle, associated with Peter the Great, if you wanted sort of, the greatest of names, was essentially making Russia a European great military fiscal power. Begins in the 17th century, ends with Russia's defeat in the Crimean War in the mid-19th century. Second great cycle of modernization, which I think of as maintaining Russia as a great power in the era of the Industrial Revolution. It begins in the mid-19th century for the simple reason that Russia's defeat in the Crimean War is a searing evidence that unless Russia modernizes and itself becomes an industrial era great power, it will not remain a great power of any sort. And one does have to remember that, of the great empires of Asia, the Qing, the Mughals, the Safavids, and to some extent the Romanovs were the only ones sort of still standing, more or less, as an independent great power. But the Qing are not gone yet, but no one wants to go their way. So, this is the major incentive for the reforms brought in by Alexander II, essentially to ensure that Russia remains a great power in what we call the modern, the industrial era. And just as Alexander I's defeat of Napoleon in 1812-14 is the great sign that Russia has succeeded in the first cycle of modernization, so Stalin's defeat of Nazi Germany is the great sign that Russia has succeeded in the second. And that second period, as I say, ends to my mind in the 1970s as changes in the world economy, above all the beginning of the era of the computer and the microchip, begin to impinge on the consciousness of the younger generation of Russian officialdom, elite officialdom, and persuades them, and above all in time Gorbachev, that unless you have a third cycle of modernization, initiated, as I say, by the state from above, Russia is going to cease to be a great power by the 21st century. The obvious parallels were with the second and third cycles of modernization, their early years. The basic point is that both with Alexander II in the 1860s, 70s, and with Gorbachev, you were talking about what you might describe as liberal modernization, in an era dominated globally by liberal ideologies and orthodoxies. This is the era of high Victorian liberalism. This is the era of Reagan and Thatcher. And it is not just that liberal values are conceived as something valuable in themselves. It is also seen as that they are essential for a community and therefore a state's power. So liberal modernization means, apart from anything else, economic liberalization, dismantling the command economy, ending serfdom. It means putting in an effective rule of law. It means loosening up on the censorship, allowing much greater freedom for discussion to the universities, etc., 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 etc. Even the terminology of Gorbachev, perestroika, glasnost, zakonnost, etc., etc., is borrowed straight from Alexander's era. Well, I mean, if you were making this comparison, the first thing that screamed in your face, or the second thing that screamed in your face anyway, was that Gorbachev was going to be in deep trouble, or at least he was going to face very great challenges. Remember that within 6 years of the death of Nicholas I, Alexander's father, and the demise of his extremely conservative and repressive regime, 6 years, perhaps no, 10 years, 8 years, you have significant sections of the Russian intelligentsia calling for the overthrow not just of the monarchy, but of private property and marriage. Things can go very quickly when you take the brakes off in Russia for all sorts of reasons. Even more obvious was that you were going to have really significant problems in the non-Russian areas. Again, 6 years after Alexander launches his reforms, you have full-scale revolution in Poland in 1863, crushed in the end by hundreds of thousands of Russian troops. It was pretty obvious that you were going to have tremendous difficulties sustaining Soviet rule in Eastern Europe, and that there were going to be very significant dangers in the non-Russian republics of the Soviet Union too. It was clear here that the problems were going to be greater than in Alexander's day. In the first place, Gorbachev's empire, the Soviet empire, extended across the whole of East Central Europe. Secondly, one was operating in an era when democracy was far more universally seen as the only legitimate ideology, and empire was death. When Alexander represses the Polish rebellion, he's only, 6 years behind the British in India, suppressing rebellion. Empire was the name of the game in those days, and democracy was still by no means the dominant political ideology or political ideology or ideology in power in Europe. So Gorbachev was going to be in trouble more broadly, and this I found absolutely astonishing. Probably the single greatest domestic challenge for the rulers of Imperial Russia was trying somehow to marry imported Western liberal ideas and institutions, all the way back to Peter, and Russian authoritarian political traditions. The old regime grappled with this for 200 years, and in the end, this dilemma played a very big part in bringing it down. And here suddenly one had Gorbachev and his entourage bringing in radical Western liberal ideas overnight, seemingly blissfully unaware of the risks, not just to the communist regime. And after all, remember that Gorbachev attempted and wished to renew the communist regime, not to destroy it initially, but also, and very obviously, to the multinational imperial state, which had been created over the last 300-400 years. It utterly astonished me that rulers of Russia could be so naive and so ignorant of Russian history. Now, I'm making this point not just in order to puff myself up. The issue here is that actually there has been a strong nationalist backlash in Russia against Soviet policies. And Putin himself, who is now talking, certainly as regards Ukraine, much more like a white general and is contemptuous of Lenin, and actually is saying that Lenin's policies of federalism played a huge part in destroying imperial Russia, et cetera, et cetera. The point here is firstly that this backlash is very important and is behind, in many ways, the present invasion of Ukraine. Also, it does have to be admitted that there is some truth to it. Again, on to the next point, step back a bit, and there were really only two conceivable paths out of communism. One of them, which is the path taken by Gorbachev, was basically to sign up to Western liberal and democratic principles. The other was the path taken by Milosevic in Yugoslavia and then Serbia, which was to fall back on the ethno-linguistic and historical nationalism of the largest community, Serbia, in his case. Well, thank God the Soviet leadership did not take the Milosevic path. There were many fears that it might. But of course, the fact that it took the Western path and that path led to the disintegration of the economy, all the disasters of the 1990s as regards plunging, living standards, radical decrease in life expectancy, you name it, and that it also resulted in the disintegration of the Soviet Union and of the imperial state, which had, after all, existed for 300 years before the Soviet Union. All of that meant that pro-Western policy, Western principles, democracy, etc., got a pretty bad name among very large sections of the Russian population. One way, and I think I said this before, if the American electorate can put Donald Trump in the White House on the slogan, "Make America Great Again," it wouldn't surprise you that with much better excuse, very many Russians voted for Putin and still support him. Okay, end of that section. If one's looking at what has gone wrong, I mean, one can point at plenty of mistakes. I think you can point at mistakes made by the West, specifically in 2014, more broadly before 2014. I was at a very interesting little sort of closed seminar the week before I came to Japan. Never spoke to so many generals in all my life. Rana Mitter was the only other historian there. And one got, there were lots of ambassadors and sort of, think tank gurus, this kind of stuff. One got the old division between the Americans and some of the North Europeans, etc., who basically said we made a big blunder by not bringing Ukraine into NATO immediately. And the other lot, the French in particular, the Germans a bit more sotto voce, but said it firmly enough in the corridors. If only it hadn't been for the wretched Scandinavians and Balts, Germany, Italy and France could have carried through a policy of EU backing for neutralization before and during 2014, which would have avoided all this mess. Now, you can argue all the ways round on this, and I don't intend to do so. The one obvious point is that the worst possible solution was to dangle Ukrainian membership of NATO under the noses of the Russians and then not carry it out. And one could make other, I think, perfectly justified criticisms of Western policy. One could make many more criticisms of Putin. All I will talk about now are criticisms, as you might say, from the right, because you will be less familiar with those than with the democratic and liberal criticisms, which are self-evident to all of us, but also because actually the criticisms from the right are more important in contemporary Russia in the immediate future. Take 2014. Sotto voce, Putin was and is widely blamed in nationalist, security, and military circles for the fact that he didn't invade in 2014 when the Ukrainians could have put up very, very little resistance. And when on top of that, he had quite good causes, excuses, choose the word you want. In the first place, for all his utter uselessness, Yanukovych was the legitimately elected president. And he was overthrown on the streets of Kiev, which is not how democracy is supposed to work. But also, and even more menacingly, there had been fighting in Odessa and quite a few pro-Russian elements had been killed. Whether you call it deliberate murder or not is, again, different perspectives. It could certainly plausibly have been called the deliberate murder of pro-Russians by Ukrainian nationalist forces. And of course, that would have given Putin the means to go all the way to Moldova, Transnistria. No one could have stopped him. He could have taken Odessa. He would have had everything. He would have had Ukraine entirely at his mercy. Instead of which, he didn't do that. He did annex Crimea, which Russian nationalists love, but on the other hand, took out of Ukraine the most pro-Russian bit of it, and therefore reduced Russian leverage in the rump Ukraine, or rump most of Ukraine. And of course, the same with the eastern Donbass. So again, the nationalists have some tactical terms, they're correct. And then, of course, again, now, although he is not publicly blamed, because you don't publicly blame the sovereign or the top man unless you're going to overthrow him. But sotto voce, of course, he's blamed in many nationalist and military and security circles for having completely mismanaged, the current war. But I must say, and I may well be wrong about this, my own sort of gloomy feeling is that what has happened in Ukraine, though certainly not inevitable, was always very possible, even perhaps probable. It always struck me that the Ukraine, which emerged as an independent state in 1991 in those borders, was going to be in deep crisis if it ever had to make fundamental choices between Russia and the West. And that is partly because the Russians would put their foot down, but it is also because, Ukraine was very divided. Odessa, I mean, I don't need to repeat the Crimea and the Donbass, but Odessa was never, in the ethno-linguistic sense, cultural sense, a Ukrainian city. You could argue it wasn't a Russian city either, it was an imperial city. And there were all sorts of other areas in Ukraine whose allegiances were very mixed and blurred. Even more to the point, within living memory, millions of Ukrainians had been killed on Ukrainian soil, very many of them by other Ukrainians fighting in the service of one or other really ghastly regime. So historical myth and memory, which is very important for a newly founded state, was a bomb. Okay, that's all I'll say about the past. Just a few words about what next. I mean, quite obviously, there are many, many uncertainties. My feeling is that we are likely to get something of a stalemate developing on the military front over the winter, and then things are likely to hot up again in the spring. Russia is banking on, above all, Western, and that means above all European fatigue over the winter in the face of very severe economic and even sort of climate pressures, the West is banking on the courage and anger and patriotism of the Ukrainian people, and on an increased flow of weapons to help the Ukrainian army. I suspect that neither side will break over the winter. I think that you might get the Italians, flaking away. I doubt whether the French, the Germans, or let alone the British will. And whatever happens in the midterms, I don't think the Republican Party will en masse desert the Ukrainian cause. Now, if we were talking about a presidential election and Trump got back in, we might be talking about something very different. So what happens next spring? And the answer is, I don't know. It depends on what happens on the battlefield. One thing I would say, and Hans will be a far better judge of this than I am, and Alan probably too. I mean, essentially, the Americans have not declared war on China, but they have, ramped up the idea of an existential conflict between China and the West, short only of armed conflict. And I think that if, and this is a big if it did look like the Russians were going to be completely defeated in Ukraine, or it looked as if not just Putin, but his regime was going to fall, then I suspect you would get a great deal more overt Chinese help from the Russians than you're getting at the moment. But I may be quite wrong. As I say, it'll be very interesting to hear what Hans and Alan, among others, say about that. I suspect the likeliest scenario next year is that there will be a ghastly amount of fighting, but that very possibly at the end, by the autumn, maybe both sides will be sufficiently exhausted to agree to some version of ceasefire. It's perfectly possible that one side or the other will succeed dramatically on the battlefield, but I suspect the chances are that they won't. But again, I might be quite wrong. What I find harder to imagine is that one will achieve not just a ceasefire, but something one might call peace. Because I find it hard to imagine that there will be a basis for agreement. I could imagine fudging the issue of Ukraine joining NATO on the principle or on the basis that if one could come to an agreement halfway satisfactory to both sides on territory, one might have a joint Russian and NATO guarantee of the treaty and of the territorial integrity of the Ukraine which remained after the treaty. And neutralization, if that was the word applied to Ukraine, which would to some extent save Putin's prestige, in no sense whatever would mean demilitarization. On the contrary, the Ukrainians could arm themselves like porcupines. That, however, would only be possible if you had some territorial agreement. Now, in my view, the least bad, the least unlikely to be the basis for a lasting peace is the status quo of February 2022. Quite apart from the fact that if the Ukrainians got back Crimea or even the eastern Donbass, no Russian regime which accepted that, I think, would retain any legitimacy for long. It would be Weimar plus plus. Actually, I think even if the Ukrainians could get the two regions back, it's greatly in their interest not to do so. Ukraine is going to have quite enough problems without taking on an awful lot of unwilling Russians. That is, roughly speaking, where I will end. I do, I'm afraid, think, as I did the last time I talked, that the likeliest scenario is a kind of Kashmir one, in which, the struggle is still going on 80 years later, of course, mostly a frozen struggle, but periodically bursting out into armed conflict with dramatically dangerous possible consequences given nuclear arms, etc. As to the broader context, and this is the last thing I would say, I was asked by the Swedes to comment about 12 years ago on where things stood in Russia and whether I would still advance the same overall perspective, 3 cycles of modernization as I did then. And I said no, partly because it seems, we are, I think, now facing potentially the biggest threat to Western and to some extent Anglophone predominance in the world since it was first established in the late 18th century. So, one is already in a different world. And to do Putin justice, already 20 years ago, when I first heard him talk, he was going on about the next 2 generations being defined by American and Chinese conflict. The other thing, of course, is that having, 200 years ago, escaped, we thought, for good from the Malthusian trap, we now have it staring at us in a sort of planetary and potentially apocalyptic form, which completely transforms the whole of international relations and the context in which we have to think anyway. At that point, I'll shut up on a nice, cheerful note.
Thank you so much, Shai.
It was half an hour for once.
That's fantastic. Well, yeah. At least one positive point in this gloomy picture. I was always, when you gave these talks, I'm always trying to find something where we can have a positive view. But it's hard.
It is hard at the moment.
When I'm thinking, just my feel, unlike you, I'm not an expert at all. One feeling I have, one scenario which I think could be imaginable. I'm imagining myself that in the future, you have something like Ukraine, like Israel, armed to the teeth and defending itself, high tech, cyber attack, cyber protection. And on the other hand, Russia is a bit like North Korea now, giving nuclear threats all the time. Could you imagine such a scenario that you have a kind of huge North Korea and
shouldn't we let Heonik in now and then? If I respond to that after.
Let's do that afterwards, yes.
But I will respond to that when Heonik's finished.
Okay, very good, very good. Thank you so much again. And Heonik, can Heonik? Oh, yes, hello. Unmute.
Right.
Hello,
yes, I'm
thank
here.
you so much and very much looking forward to your talk now.
Okay, great to see so many senior colleagues and fellows here and alumni in Japan. Since I prepared, I'll pick up a few things from Chai's talk, but mind you that I'm not a historian, I'm an anthropologist, but I have the credential, something like I'm a child of Glasnost, Gorbachev, and I began my PhD in 1989. I was a part of this small contingent from Cambridge Anthropology Department, literally parachuted to behind Iron Curtain. And originally I wanted to go to Central Asia. I didn't get permission to go there. And I was very surprised to get this invitation from what the Russians used to call then Pogranichny zone, heavily armed area of Far Eastern Siberia and the island of Sakhalin. And I wanted to go to large collective farmers, state farm kolkhoz or sovkhoz, but I didn't get funding, so I had to go to small, very tiny indigenous hunting and herding collective farm in the very far north of Sakhalin Island. I have absolutely no regret that I didn't choose to go there, but I was chosen by the place, and it was a decisive experience. So I spent my first year as an anthropologist or ethnographer in Soviet Russia, Asiatic part of Soviet Russia, during the transition from Gorbachev to Yeltsin. It was a hard time. So my talk is, I mean, my knowledge of Russia is very confined within that experience. But since this talk is happening in Trinity, Japan, Russia is both European and Asiatic, polity. So my talk is about how to imagine the current situation in the far western part of Eurasia, which is far eastern part of Europe, from the perspective of far eastern part of Eurasia. And I'll bring in an episode about a group of stateless people and trans-Siberian migrants on that note. But let me start with a few things that I've been doing in dialogue with people in Chai's field, international history, international relations. It has a lot to do with this book that I wrote in 2010. It's called Dear the Cold War. So I'm known as something like an anthropologist, old anthropologist who is interested in Cold War history. And so I've been invited to write a sequel to this, with a simple title, Dear the Cold War #2, or something like that. And I'm slowly preparing my mind for that project. But I'll begin with the 2005, I remember, in State of Nation address by Vladimir Putin. He said the collapse of the Soviet order was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. This is very widely mentioned in media today. And then, so the question that comes out from this blunt statement, very serious statement, 2005, as I said, is that I'm from Korea originally. Korea is kind of one of the chapters in Dear the Cold War. This book deals with the temporality of the Cold War. How can you say the Cold War ended globally, just passing the threshold from 80s to 90s? Because there are localities that are stuck in Cold War order, and that was one question this book dealt with. So for people in Korea or other places, and mind you that I didn't know at the time before I arrived, but while reading literature about the island of Sakhalin, I realized that there is kind of a question of fate, because Sakhalin, in retrospect, is the first Cold War society or territory in modern history divided between Soviet power and Japanese power as early as 1925. I mean, we can push that in 1905, immediately after Russo-Japanese War. So it became sort of like a Cold War territory way before the Cold War became universal, particularly in the in European and East Asian context. Right, and then the question that comes out of this statement that I introduced earlier, the Putin's 2005 State of Nation address, is that whereas majority of Europeans in Western Europe and Eastern Europe and Central Europe included, apart from minorities, the end of the Cold War was happy time, it's a hopeful time. Now the curtain is gone, and the world is gone, and we can travel free, and we can talk to each other, and we can vision some other way of living. the hard border is never good, right? We know that with the island. And, being a Korean, it's, kind of saying that the end of Soviet order, or if we translate it in other terms, the end of the Cold War was greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. It's hard to swallow that because it's because in their part of the world, people desire the end of the Cold War as such to arrive, even if albeit a generation later, or sometimes so, not in 100 years or something like that. So I start with this question, and the derivative question that comes up, it relates to the thing that one of the things that Chai mentioned is in relation, in the literature that is being pouring out today, or in the media, I'm sure you came across this this idea that the new Cold War or Cold War II. So at least the notion that, well, from 1991 for a generation, we had a life in post-Cold War world, right? We don't know how to define it, but Cold War is no longer, and so it's a post-Cold War world. Now it is post-Cold War world. And the reading, I'm just beginning to read this new literature, including, I was just reading this book, The New Cold War. And there are two trajectories. There are two ideas about the new Cold War. On the terrain that Hans is involved, and Chai mentioned, in say like 2010 and past 15 years, let's say past 15 years, but the more dominant rhetoric is about the new Cold War, touches upon the growing contest of power between the United States and People's Republic of China, right? So that concerns the world, but more critically, the Asia-Pacific region, or in today's language, in the Pacific region, whatever it is. And especially the broader East Asia, the region that Alistair Morgan is very much engaged with. And at the core of which, among other things, is the question of North Korea, right? So there is a nuclear threat and nuclear proliferation and great power conflicts, right? Everybody is nervous. And I do talk on regular basis with colleagues in Taiwan, as well as those in Korea, and a few friends in Japan about this thing, right? And now suddenly, it's not very suddenly, but apparently there is on the European theater, there is a new Cold War, and that has squarely to do with the reemergence of Russia as a hopeful great power. And this book, Return to Cold War, is about the collapse of Soviet order and the weakening of Russia, both economically and politically and culturally, and the way that Russia tries to undo the humiliation of the past generation. So what I'm saying is when we talk about the broad geopolitics, and I'm not really in favor of this notion of the new Cold War, because for me, the Cold War, all Cold War, had some sort of ideology, whether you call it empire of liberty, empire of equality, or communism or capitalism or communism versus anti-communism, but at least one side, socialist side, they had a clear, radically different vision for modern life. So there was an ideological element, but so-called New Cold War, I don't see, I'm trying really hard, but I can't see any ideological difference between these two parties or multiple parties that talk about the return of the Great Divide. Anyway, but never mind this, the New Cold War is becoming a rhetorical currency in today's world, so we are obliged to engage with it. Anyway, and then in it, there are two different New Cold War. One is focused on re-emergence of Russia as a hopeful great power, and on the Pacific side, if you like, Atlantic side and Pacific side is already, the reality of emergence of China as a great power and is desired to be recognized as such. So there are two things, right? And then we are not here to talk about the Pacific theater of the New Cold War as such. And so let's return to the Atlantic or European theater of the New Cold War. And the question I asked myself, and I tried to find an answer in literature, is what Russia is doing, or what I can't say what Russia is doing. Let's say what Putin is doing. Although, as Chai mentions, Putin is not alone. He's not solitary actor. But let's say that he's particular actor. Well, if he wants to make Russia great again, right? In his speech a couple of days ago, he mentioned silny, meaning strong, and veliki, great, about 5 times in his speech in reference to Russia as such, NATO. And so if in the propensity to make Russia great again, where is this the element of greatness from the past located? So, which means that if there is, as many people say, there is a huge economy of nostalgia in today's Russia about the past, and what is it nostalgic about? Is it Soviet Empire, Soviet order, or pre-Soviet era? So it is the big question among scholars and observers who are more trained in social science, and then the debate is within broad European anthropology, the scholars who specialize in Eastern Europe or Russia or even Ukraine, the broad consensus is kind of hybrid form. Yeah, there is definitely nostalgia for pre-Soviet Russian Empire, but we can't ignore that the fact that this is jumbled up with this production of nostalgia for the Soviet time, and the nostalgia for Great Patriotic War, the Second World War, it belongs to the latter, and pre-Soviet, and among other things, my colleagues in European anthropology mention quite frequently the element of religion. And there is an Russian Orthodox religion and state and church collusion, but I don't know much about it because in Siberia there was none of it, but it is kind of strong rise of religious mysticism in the 1990s, as we see in the United States to a great degree, this kind of religious right, and then the chosen people and that sort of thing. Right? So I'll skip that one. But that is what I'm learning from current literature in anthropology and social science of today's Russia. So I mentioned briefly earlier on that there is no ideology. I don't see any ideology. Maybe some people may be able to see. So I don't see what is going on today as a new Cold War. But there is a if you are so geopolitically minded, right? To the extent that you don't consider ideology any meaningful factor in politics, that's okay. There is this new Cold War, but I can't do that. It's my disciplinary ethos doesn't allow me to do that. Culture and ideology are vital in human life. So within the confines of my discipline, I can't ignore the presence or absence of ideological the texture of ideology, and then I have problem with the idea of the new Cold War. But it is my ongoing self reflection, if you like. But the other vital aspect, one vital aspect is in the two trajectories of the so-called New Cold War, the Atlantic and Pacific, if you like, European and East Asian. The East Asian part is getting really entrenched into two triangular relations: Russia, China, North Korea, and then South Korea, Japan, and United States. And it seems to be obvious. And I don't know whether it's a good thing. And I think my colleagues in Japan, there are friends in Japan are very much worried about it. And the same goes to my colleagues in Seoul, and many senior colleagues in the United States. But so in a way, what it entails is that it seems not far-fetched to imagine that Putin's nuclear card, whatever, we don't know, the tactical nuclear card, and then North Korea's nuclear ambition. So far, they didn't talk to each other, or they spoke to each other, but in kind of not as friends, but as strangers, very egocentric strangers. But we may have to consider the possibility that this is two nuclear cars on the far western part of Eurasian continent, and the other side can make a dialogue between the two. So that's what frightens me a lot. I'm really, and so what that makes us who are involved in Asian studies unable to ignore what is happening in the European context. So what I'm saying is, Trinity Japan is, I congratulate Gerhard to organize this in Trinity Japan on very European question, which, as I tried to deliver to you, is far from only European question on. Yeah, so that's what it is. And so as a way of, I take Gerhard's point about hopefulness very important. I take it very important. I mean, since this Ukraine crisis occurred, I can't watch really seriously social realist cinema. I mean, it's too real. So I go into more fantasy films that tend to end in happy way. I don't know, maybe I feel fragile. So I'll tell you one episode, I mean, one group of people, a lot of people actually, that involve, whose historical trajectory involve Russo-Japanese War and Russia, Japan, Korea, Ukraine, and Central Asia, everything, okay? So in the late 19th century, when Japan, in the beginning of from late 19th century, beginning of 20th century, a large number of Koreans crossed the river and migrated to Manchuria, Northeast China now. And many of them, after Japan came to take control of this northeastern part of China, they moved on to Far East Russia, Primorsky Krai. It's where Vladivostok and Khabarovsk, you know, these cities are located. And that's the birth of North Korean Revolution. Kim Il-sung was operating in Manchuria, and he moved to far eastern part of Russia and waged guerrilla warfare against Japanese Imperial Army. And that's kind of like this birth legend of a North Korean statehood. And so I'm not talking about these partisans, but there was just so many poor, nearly starving Korean peasants living in Primorsky Krai. And many of them later on moved to cities, Ussurisk and elsewhere. And then 1937, when Stalin couldn't, you know, for Stalin, you know, thought, you know, Koreans and Japanese look the same and they're kind of mixed up together and stuff like that. So how can you trust this population? They can turn into all Japanese spy. So in one day, in October 1937, he ordered to move 170,000 Soviet Koreans from Far Eastern part of Russia, crossing all the way, crossing the Eurasian continent, all the way to Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan as rice farmers. And then there they had no right for mobility. But 1956, when Khrushchev allowed them to move about a little bit, many of them, Koreans love studying, you know, as I do, and they moved to Kiev to study, many. They thought Kiev was the place to go to study. And many peasants who were doing, it's complicated, I'll skip that, but it's peasants, and moved to southern and eastern part of what is today Ukraine as contract farmers, so many of them. So by the time Russia's war against Ukraine took place, today's war, there were about 20,000, possibly more, Koreans who were basically stateless. They had, many of them carried all Soviet passports, and the state of Ukraine didn't recognize them, and they left, you know, Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan many years ago, and so they lost the touch with their their original home, which became independent anyway. So the Soviet passport carrying Koreans were stuck in this stressful war. And so they were, on the one hand, stateless, but on the other hand, these people who lost the time, who missed out the time where the Soviet Empire broke down and became all these new states, right? So they live like Soviet citizens, you know, defunct Soviet citizens. And I'm in communication with a colleague who is involved, who is engaged with these people, and some of them went to Western Europe, Poland, and Austria, just like the elite or the Ukrainians moved before the crisis, and then many of them went back to Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan because they had to get out of Ukraine. And especially those people who were carrying old Soviet passports, i.e. stateless people, had nowhere to go. So a few months ago, about 2,000 of them, with great difficulty and etc., they arrive in South Korea, and they are creating a community in a city called Gwangju. And then I'm looking forward to visiting that place and speaking to a few people. But what I heard is this. This is a hopeful part, you know. And even among these people who were persecuted and by the early Soviet order, there are many people who are absolutely loyal to Russia. And there are people who lived long enough in Ukraine and who are absolutely loyal to Ukraine. So there are two groups. I mean, there are actually three groups. And these two groups do not get along in this new village they are trying to create. And the third group, in which people are more critical of everything or trying to bring themselves back to their ancestral home, etc., trying to do some mediation between these Russophilia Koreans and Ukrainephilia Koreans. And what I heard is this third force, especially the elders, trying their best to make a bridge between the two groups. So there is non-violent, small civil war going on in this small community of stateless people, refugees in an obscure village in South Korea. And there, the conflict continues. They bring the conflict, but there are people who try to make peace between the two. So hopefully that's going to work out. Thank you.
This was a very moving talk, Heonik. Thank you so much. You know, when I was listening to you, I had to think about a talk at the Austrian embassy here in Tokyo, which I heard. I can't reproduce all the details now, but it was a talk which was about Austro-German Jewish musicians in Shanghai. You have heard about them, you know. So there was, during the Second World War, when, you know, Hitler, Germany, and in Austria as well, and many other areas, Jewish people were very, very heavily prosecuted and killed in all over, you know, what was influenced by Germany or controlled by Germany, and also other areas. And so music brought this community, you know, some positive attitudes to the community. So you know about this case. Hello?
No, but I can imagine. Yes,
I can send you the links afterwards.
Yes, please do.
Yes, yeah, I don't know how much it is related to this
wonderful
discussion, but it shows like how there are glimpses of how people look for positive feelings for music, in very depressing times.
Thank you.
Maybe if we start the discussion, maybe between Dominic and Heonik, if you like. Dominic, I'm sure you have thoughts about Heonik's talk now.
Yeah, well, I was going to add an anecdote to an anecdote. I remember having dinner with this lovely old Jewish character who was one of the thousands of Jews in Lithuania who'd been given a visa by the Japanese vice consul in Kaunas and escaped, much to the bewilderment of the Japanese government, because, I mean, the vice consul operated completely on his own initiative against regulations. But the Japanese government, when these thousands of Jews arrived in Japan, ended up by dumping an awful lot of them in the international settlement in Shanghai, which of course then was in Japanese occupied territory. And the irony was that they treated them, or they defined them as Germans, honorary Germans, and therefore allies. These were Jews who, of course, had fled Hitler. So, I mean, life has all sorts of strange ironies, but it was certainly a sort of odd and interesting twist to that history of Jews in Eastern Europe, as well as to Japanese attitudes. What was I going to? I was going to ask Heonik something, but because I wasn't going to push myself forward, as I was going to leave things to other people to ask questions, I've now forgotten what it was. Well, let me respond instead to you, Gerhard, and what you said. I mean, look, that's the kind of dream, isn't it? That the Ukrainians, in a sense that, history rewards the Ukrainians, that they become the modern, successful, IT-driven economy, and that the price of taking this nationalist line and invading neighbor means that Putin's Russia becomes ever more backward in global terms. Of course, one aspect of this is that, and again, you can see why to some extent, Putin and his elite have bought into the idea that America is, the West are completely on the slide. The future belongs to China. And one aspect of that future is really the superiority of state capitalism. Now, you can see all the reasons why they might, want to say this. And I think you'd also have to say that even if Xi Jinping and co can perhaps bring off a successful variant of state capitalism in the next 10, 15 years, it's very hard to imagine the Russians doing it. But that is certainly one idea that's driving them. Oh, I know what I wanted to say. Well, I was Heonik. Of course, the ideological.
Dominic, Heonik he left for a moment. He will be back in 3 minutes. So
well, don't worry. Well, let other people join in.
Maybe you take a note so that you can pick it up.
Yeah. No, I've written it down. But let other people ask.
And let's take one question in between to you, Dominic, because Heonik is not here now. He will be back in a moment. So who is there somebody who wants to ask a question? If there isn't, I would ask Alistair maybe, because you are maybe closest to from your field of specialization and might have the most connected questions.
Well, I think Heonik has come back, which
yes,
means that you can revert to your original plan.
Okay, Dominic.
Yeah, one thing which struck me, when you talked about there not being an ideological conflict. Look, obviously, I can understand exactly what you're saying, and to a great extent agree with it. It's not as sharp as it was in the Cold War. On the other hand, I have a sort of feeling that once the United States gets involved in a conflict, there's always an ideological element to it, because the United States is defined by ideology. You're an American because you believe certain things. And I think that although obviously there's a realpolitik, all sorts of other things involved in conflict, I think it has become to some extent ideological. I think the Chinese, who previously were saying, essentially just leave us alone to get on with things in our own sweet way, in our own sweet country, or even our own sweet region of the world, are now a bit, and with, you can understand why, arguing that actually look at the mess that Western democracy is in, particularly look at the mess of American democracy, our system works better. So, I mean, I think there is the beginning of that. I said this, and I say it with, to some extent, tongue-in-cheek, but I said it in this last book I wrote. I mean, I think if you're going back to the deep roots, there's a sort of Plato versus Aristotle in it. The Chinese Confucian bureaucracy is, to my mind, historically, important embodiment of the Platonic principle of guardianship, and there's enough of that that comes through, inherently in Marxism-Leninism, and certainly in contemporary China, to my understanding, to mean that it's not just a kind of silly catchphrase. And actually the criticism of the West and Western democracy, which you get from Putin and you get from Xi Jinping by now, is nothing to do with Marxism-Leninism. It's to do with old right, old conservative contempt for the masses, basic belief that ordinary people are too goofy or too sort of sinful, wicked, or just too busy getting on with a living to really be given a serious say in government. And that, government is best left to an experienced, trained elite. Now, I think Plato would probably fall down dead with horror at the sight of much of the contemporary Chinese, in inverted commas, Platonic elite. But then I suspect Aristotle might have a few worries about, contemporary American democracy. Some of them very wicked. I mean, he'd be most depressed to see women having the vote. And after all, he took slavery for granted and maybe even thought that it was a necessary basis for the kind of middle class which, alone had male citizenship. Nevertheless, I mean, you can see there are elements of that Aristotelian principle there. And certainly his basic idea that once you had a sufficient number of potential citizens, by which he meant, in our terms, middle-class educated males, you had to have democracy. It was the only system of government which was feasible in a city-state, of course, in a city-state. One always has to emphasize that. That's Washington consensus, essentially. And the whole business of American federalism was an attempt to get the advantages of Republican self-government and the advantages of empire by having a federal system and the maximum amount of locals, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, I can see even very, very, very distant sort of deep roots of ideological conflict, So I would say, I mean, I thoroughly agree with you that this is not as clear-cut as it was in the Cold War. But I would say that it is there, and it's actually getting stronger by the day on the whole. If only because on both sides, they now have to rationalize and legitimize in the eyes of their own populations this conflict.
Yeah, Charlie, it's a great point, and it's a tricky. I found it a really interesting point, and it's something to think about. But the 2 points, I think one is, I think it's different state actors. If there is a new Cold War on the other side of the threshold, the leaders and powers that be are interested in bringing out an ideological form of their political rule. So we can say that something may be on the way. I had a really interesting chat some years ago with a few people in China's University for Minority Peoples, and then in a dinner I asked one really smart gentleman. So the conversation was about whether China has a theory of, different theory of international politics. Yeah, and then I regret so much that I have spoken about that, because he's just stopped eating and he started thinking about it throughout the dinner. And so I think something may emerge, and I think there's something is emerging, and there are things in the making. But if we see the Cold War, the ideological texture of the Cold War era, especially along the side that was critical of predominant liberal internationalism, had international ideology.
Yeah, no, you're quite right.
But I don't see how international things can be.
The only thing I would look, I think again, you're basically right on it. I mean, I haven't.
Global solidarity. How can you make global solidarity other than kind of practical?
I think the one thing that you could possibly say, certainly as regards the third world, is that there are many people who agree to some extent, sometimes sotto voce, sometimes not, and becoming louder on the whole, that if democracy works in the first world, it's a luxury we can't afford in the third. I mean, I think there is some resonance in parts of the third world to the Chinese idea that given the challenges facing third world countries, particularly with climate change coming over the horizon, it is very easy to argue that democracy simply turns into anarchy. The old conservative argument, but particularly relevant when you're dealing with relatively new polities made up of all sorts of different ethno-linguistic groups, tribalism in the old, whatever. And of course, you can point to the contemporary United States to say that tribalism is essentially taking over there. Of course, it's not, well, it is to some extent racially defined, but not completely by any manner of means, but that it's paralyzing government and to some extent making the United States a potential international danger and laughing stock. So again, I think, although, you could get up in a Western university, certainly until very late on, and if not quite, you wouldn't probably be defending the Soviet Union by the 1970s in strict Marxist-Leninist terms, in the way that you might well have been in the 1930s, or even possibly in the sort of early 50s. You can't get up in Cambridge University and say that basically Xi Jinping's right about democracy. It's a shambles, although some of the British, opposition intellectuals opposing Brexit have now come to say, well, they're sort of about a third of the way down the line in their denunciations of the idiocy of the English people. I mean, there is a subtext there. You're not allowed to say it openly. Apart from else, it's a bloody stupid thing to say if you're trying to get people to vote for you. I think you could probably say it more loudly in much of Africa, and even in parts of South America. We all know the opposite argument, which is that you allow some kind of gang in with no controls, no elections, no law. God only knows what they'll do next.
Great. I thought Anastasia, I don't think we have met you yet. So if you like to have a question, do you like to ask Anastasia if she's here?
Hello, hi.
Oh, yes, hello. I'm sorry to interrupt you here, but we haven't heard from you. So if you have a question, why don't you take part in the discussion, if you like?
Well, thank you. I think I'm still processing. A couple of interesting points. I really kind of enjoy the insight of Koreans moving pretty much all across Europe and coming home. And being Russian, I think I get very emotional about this topic, which is, I guess, understandable. But I think I don't have a question at the moment, but I do have kind of a couple of thoughts that I'd like just some time to gather. And yeah, I might have questions later on.
Okay.
Thank you, though.
So, Anastasia, are you Russian based in Tokyo?
No, I came to the UK to study Japanese. I was at Oxford, then I was at Cambridge doing anthropology.
I see.
I'm still based in Cambridge.
You're still in Cambridge, are you?
I'm in Cambridge, yes.
Okay, okay, great.
Anastasia is joining because how long have you studied Japanese? What exactly are you doing in Japanese? You study the language or culture or literature or history or?
I moved away from the academia. I did a degree at St. Petersburg State University in well, I think it was just called Oriental Studies, and then I did a master's at St. Anne's in Oxford. It was called Modern Japanese Studies, the course. My interest was around well, it was actually social robotics, so social robots. That was my kind of the last project that I did.
Okay, well, that's you can forget about the ideology, I think, except if you want to build ideological robots or something like this.
Well, I mean, it's still, I mean, Japan is very much, you know, as you all will know, very much, you know, kind of regurgitating the past with Korea and the Ainu.
Yes.
So I think a lot of questions are very much relevant to Japan as well. And obviously, as Heonik mentioned, you know, Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands, very much a precursor of, again, I never looked at it that way, but a precursor of the Cold War, which was an interesting point. So thank you.
Thank you, Anastasia. What about Alistair? If you, I've asked you before, so if you like to, I mean, your work in North Korea or with North Korea it's so relevant here. So
well, maybe. Thank you, Gerhard. I'm very conscious that I'm not working on Ukraine or on Russia, and I think there are many people here who probably know a lot more about that than I do, and may have more pertinent points and comments to make. I was listening and learning. It's a pleasure to be back on with in contact with Heonik, who I've spoken to before about North Korea and other things. And I'd say that, I mean, Heonik has spoken about his Cold War writing, but I was thinking at the start of this about, or in the discussion about some of his other writing, what Heonik has written about war and memory and forgiveness as well. And his most recent book, at least I think it's his most recent book, about after the Korean War, looking at the divisions that were caused within families and other units in the South and in the North. And you know, I think, I'm afraid, like Dominic, but knowing much less about it, I find it very hard to see how you get to a real situation of peace from the Ukraine and Russia. But some of the issues that Heonik looked at as an anthropologist, but as it's a discipline that goes beyond a formal structure, I think. I mean, about human questions are probably relevant now, and I hope will be relevant in the future when there is a state of peace. I mean, just on North Korea, I mean, I heard what Heonik was saying about the nuclear threat from North Korea. I mean, I've watched or keep watching North Korea in relation to Russia and Ukraine, and you could imagine that North Korea could have responded in a different way and could have seen the latest invasion of Ukraine as a sort of imperialistic, hegemonic entry into an independent territory, and if you like, sided with Ukraine, seeing that from its own North Korean perspective in relation to the United States. But it of course has done the opposite, and really, I think, partly for reasons of ideology, to come back to the question about ideology and the Cold War, but very much pragmatically as well, as seeing what Russia is doing as a threat in a way to the United States, and from the North Korean position of its own independence and wish to maintain its nuclear program, and the divisions in the Security Council being critical to that in some ways. So actually having very good reasons from its perspective for siding with Russia, voting with Russia, and recognizing the whatever you want to call them, the breakaway republics. But I haven't really got any questions for Dominic. I just have to listen to the very, very enlightening things that he says. Thank you.
Is John still there?
Can I respond?
Yeah, you go on it. Yeah.
Right. Yes, Alistair, thank you very much. A new book came out, actually. I meant to send it to you. It's first time I engaged with the colonial history. It's about the long 20th century in Asia Pacific, with the Korea question included, and Japan is very much in it seen from a religious historical perspective. So Shintoism and American evangelicalism, and the Korea is a singularly evangelical society in broader Asia, and Kim Il-sung is singularly preeminent. He's from most preeminent Christian family in the against the background of American Northern Presbyterianism, and so trying to make sense of this currents of religion. So but it's yes, after the Korean War, but the theme is how do we imagine the path for reconciliation and peace, if not international peace, some sort of the social peace, right? And then I speak to colleagues and friends. I don't have many friends in Ukraine, but I still have friends in Russia, and we exchange emails. And then, brothers and sisters stop talking because either because they leave, one of them lives in Ukraine and the other lives in Russia, and one married to Russian and the other married to Ukrainian. And then, but on the question of place and kinship, the family is completely fallen apart and torn apart. So many, and then all Russians and all Ukrainians, either brothers and sisters, or at least cousins, at least the second cousins. So if we think of a broader sense of kinship, they're all kinsmen and women in many ways, in a number of families. And I'm not saying the two states are doing it, and one is far more responsible for than the other, but war is the dynamics of war is such that there is war is done with the two players, right? And then so it's the border families, borderline individuals, and whose life have long history of crossing the border or no sense of border between Russia and Ukraine. And truly, I mean, in true sense, is Slavic people, borderless. And the really indigenous Eastern Slav. And how do we empower them? How do we empower them? How do we empower their stories more? Starting with the conflicts and being torn apart, but the daily effort to make certain concessions with each other and stuff like that. And really intimate stories, real Slavic stories. How do we empower this? And the same goes to Korea questions.
I think if I could come in there, I mean, I think part of the problem was that, I mean, at one level, you're dead right. I mean, I wouldn't say all Ukrainians have Russian second cousins, but of course there is a vast amount of intermarriage, not just, I mean, in the really old days, of course, the great majority of the populations were peasant, and their identity had much more to do with being peasants and being orthodox than it did with modern conceptions of ethno-linguistic national identity, which were virtually meaningless to peasants there, just as they were to peasants in most other parts of the world. But on top of all of that, and on top of the complication that in the border areas, they spoke dialects which were incomprehensible to sort of bourgeois Russians or Ukrainians in Kiev or Moscow. You also have the fact that, I mean, it was such a weird old mix. I mean, Odessa was everything under the sun. It wasn't Russian or Ukrainian in any ethno-linguistic sense. Then on top of everything else, you have the fact that, and this I think was very, very important, it helps to explain why there wasn't an immediate bust up. I mean, the Russian identity of most of the population of the Donbass and a lot of other Russian speakers and even sort of ethnic Russians in Ukraine was not Russian in the pre-revolutionary sense. It was Soviet. They had some sense of Soviet identity, and Soviet Russian and Soviet Ukrainian was all mixed up together in a very complicated way. So when, I mean, Russian identity itself was split. And of course, we're coming from a white Russian emigre family, admittedly, not ethnic Russian, but these people in the Eastern Ukraine, they didn't identify even with Boris Yeltsin and his lot, let alone with the real, genuine, pure Russian nationalists who basically rejected much of the Soviet regime and were harking back to the church and the Cossacks, even to some extent to the monarchy, and to the Russian old empire. So you've got this extraordinary mishmash of different sort of identities overlapping, which, as always with these identities, only really become conscious when they're faced with the collapse of the Soviet Union and other people who they don't like. So it's been an extraordinary tragedy. I mean, the great thing about the collapse of the Soviet Union, at least in my certainly, and the most surprising thing was that a vast empire of this sort, if you call it that, with a very cruel political history and tradition, collapses with virtually no bloodshed. I mean, that's almost unique in the history of collapsing empires. If you'd said in 1985 in the West that the Soviet Union would go in 6 years' time, people would have defined you as an ultra right-wing, this and that. If you'd said that it would go with barely a shot fired in its defense, you'd have been defined as a nutter. And that was miraculous. That was really miraculous. And now that's gone too. Now the Ukrainians above all, but even the Russians are being dragged back into the 20th century history of conflict, war, and it just makes you weep.
If I may add to what Heonik and Dominic have said, I mean, it's part of the rhetoric that Putin is using as well, kind of calling us Slavic people, and not distinguishing between the Ukrainians and Russians. And I think it's a fairly dangerous kind of path to go down, because you know, what he says is that the word Ukraina comes from the word Akraina, which means the outskirts. So I'm not sure. I can see where you're coming from, Yannick, talking about the Slavs, but in this context, I think it's a fairly dangerous path to take.
Agree, totally agree. Yes,
there is.
I shouldn't. Yeah, I didn't have to mention Slav. Family, friendship. Yeah.
But I mean, I think it's quite apart from that. I mean, I know a lot of my Russian friends, even if they've not got any Ukrainian blood. I mean, my closest friend in Moscow, his mother was stuck near Kharkov. You know, I mean, he is well aware. I mean, my last book before, a lot of sort of military added to it. Of course, you know, my family background means that I was persona grata with people who would be regarded as very conservative indeed in the West. But, you know, the idea that the Russian army is shelling a place where his mother lives, for my friend Victor, is completely appalling, because he is basically an old-fashioned patriot, you know. So we don't know what side he's supposed to be on all of this, except that the whole thing's an utter tragedy. You know.
Can I just to kind of emphasize a point which Anastasia made is, Dominic Chai, you were just talking about the blood, you know, but as a scientist, okay, I'm not Trinity has many far more qualified biological scientists, many of them with Nobel Prizes. So, but in my naive physicist view, what science fact enables you to say that blood is in any way associated with something like Slavic?
This was a metaphor. I was using it as a metaphor.
Yeah, I know. But
identity, of course, is in the mind above all else, and in all sorts of other things. What I was going to say, though, is, you know, it is interesting that Putin's plan, I don't think he ever intended to occupy what I still think of as Habsburg Ukraine. What they wanted to do was to go back to the status quo in 1914. Because, of course, in their understanding, which is not true but has some element of truth, what essentially has happened is that the Habsburg Ukraine has taken over the whole of Ukraine, thanks partly to Lenin. I mean, that, to put things in a nutshell, is, you know, Putin's interpretation of this. What is, to my mind, interesting is that the most intelligent police chief ever to serve the Russian state, my old hero Pyotr Donavo, who was the man who put down the 1905 revolution, he wrote this secret memorandum to Nicholas II in February 1914, whose main gist was to say that, look, if you go to war with Germany, this will be a long war. It will test society, you know, political, all these things. We will collapse. And if if the monarchy collapses, we'll go all the way to extreme socialism, etc., etc. But he also said to Nicholas II, you know, these nuts on the Russian right who want to annex Habsburg Ukraine are extremely dangerous. At the moment, he wrote to Nicholas, we can control the Ukrainian nationalist movement within the empire. It's not really a serious threat yet. But if you annex the cradle of Ukrainian nationalism, i.e. Habsburg Ukraine, the consequences could be catastrophic for Russia. So it's interesting. I think if Stalin had not annexed the Habsburg Ukraine and the Baltic republics, I think very possibly, even probably, the core of the Soviet Union, which would have meant Belarus, Ukraine, Russia, and Kazakhstan, might at least for a time have survived as a single unit despite the collapse of communism. Because if you look at what happened in 85 to 91, I mean, the role of the Baltic republics and of formerly Habsburg Ukraine was very, very, very important in the growth of anti-centralist nationalism in the Soviet Union. But I mean, you know, that's overstretch. That's overstretch. And overstretch is exactly what Putin and his crew have done right now, you know.
Chai, one more point which just comes to my mind, because you took this bigger picture in Eastern Europe. What about Poland? I mean, Poland is one of the biggest supporters of Ukraine now. And I mean, before the Ukraine war, I was thinking that Poland and Hungary, with all these legal these disputes with the EU about law and stuff, but now they are completely on opposite sides in the conflict. No? So
well, that is
the role of Poland
Polish nationalism is defined against Russia in a way that Hungarian is not, to the same extent. But also, and fascinating, if you go back into history, the Poles and the Ukrainians were bitter enemies. And actually, traditionally, the Poles are seen by most of the Ukrainian elite as much more of an enemy than Russia.
Really?
I mean, what Putin is saying now would actually have been taken as more or less common sense by most educated Ukrainians in the Russian Empire in 1850. You know, yes, lots of interesting local folklore, this and that, but in political terms were basically Russians, you know, etc., etc. So, I mean, all these national identities are, to some extent, the creation of history, and to some extent, even the deliberate creation of intelligentsias.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of imposed by education in order to make people stand behind the country they live in. Huh?
Yes, it is also, though, ironically, by forcing massive ethnic cleansing on both sides.
That also,
Poles
I mean, that
and
seems
Ukrainians
to be
at the
taking
end of the
place
Second
right
World
now.
War. Stalin himself did a great deal to solve the traditional Ukrainian-Polish enmity. I mean, there were great massacres on both sides, particularly, you know, Ukrainians massacring Poles in the Second World War. Stalin forced them in both directions, and therefore the populations were separated. And a good deal of the Polish and Ukrainian intelligentsia in exile during the Cold War, in a sense, came to the conclusion that they, you know, they should bury the historical hatchet and should unite in an anti-Russian position, you know. And to some extent that was true, and they have. And it's been, if you know anything about the history of Polish-Ukrainian relations, it's been a very remarkable turnaround, but one which was quite carefully cultivated and prepared by the two emigre intelligentsias in the Cold War.
Okay.
Speaking of,
yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, I was just going to add, sort of going along the lines of, you know, where do we draw the line of identity for Ukrainians and Russians? Obviously, part of Ukraine is Catholic, the other part is more Orthodox. There's one divide, but it also stirred up the discussions within Russia. And I think an overlooked power is Kadyrov in Chechnya.
Oh my God.
And in my view, that's probably the biggest threat that Putin sees. I think if he, what I've been observing of the past couple of weeks, you know, Kadyrov has spoken out publicly. He's probably one of the very few people who can say things on Twitter or to the media about, you know, Putin's army actions, even though he doesn't, he always, you know, publicly supports the president, and yet things he's said clearly attacks his policies in Ukraine. And I think, to me, it seems like, you know, the Chechen wars of the 90s is what Putin sees as possibly the biggest threat within the country, and possibly it fuels his desire to, you know, keep pushing west. But that's just an observation.
Yes, I mean, I think one thing that Kadyrov does, though, in these criticisms, of course, they do also, to some extent, appeal to Putin because he himself is putting the blame on the generals. Well, of course, there's some truth in that. They've made an utter mess. But, I mean, who chose the generals and who designed the strategy? Putin. And actually, if you could get the military people quietly on this, you know, to talk to them, I'm sure a lot of them would say, look, we would have won if the idiot hadn't imposed on us his stupid ideas about, you know, how easy this was going to be. And and had let us do it our way. He didn't even have a single commander-in-chief. And his idea that the Ukrainians were going to roll over explains why he basically put in, if not quite in the first line, then certainly in the second line, basically sort of National Guard, who are great at thugging up unarmed demonstrators, but not so good when people shoot back at them, particularly people who are much better trained than they are and much better motivated. So, I mean, I think it's interesting. You can't attack Putin. The moment when you actually blame Putin for this will be the day after he's overthrown, or the year after he retires into gentle exile in some villa near Beijing. But I'm sure it's bubbling there under the surface. Must be. This mess is his mess. He chose the generals. He got rid of the generals who might have stood up to him. He designed the strategy. That wasn't the generals who did that. And of course, now the whole thing is messed up. He is happy enough to have Kadyrov pushing it, on them. But that would be my interpretation anyway. It's certainly, one of my former PhD students is a character called Mark Galeotti, whose subject is partly the contemporary Russian army. That is certainly his interpretation of things. And I think Mark's right. I mean, what's interesting, because, I come from a white Russian emigre family from the old lot, and the white emigration is split. My cousins, a lot of my cousins, particularly in Paris, these are pure Trubetskoys, Galitsins, the whole caboodle. Most of them are for Putin in the older generation anyway, because he's essentially, what's he spouting? He's spouting the ideology of the white counter-revolution and of the monarchy. Regathering the Russian lands, Russia one great and indivisible. So it's interesting and sad to watch. It's not as traumatic in the emigration as it is if you're a family in Russia, of course, because you can have these arguments and not talk to each other, but your jobs and you're not threatened with going to jail or anything.
If it's okay, there's Alan he wants to bring in a...
Hello, Alan.
He wants to ask something about China. Alan.
Yeah, I was going to try to follow with Heonik, particularly a couple of points he made, that he, of course, was following in the steps of Chekhov, who was there just a century ago, and I was longing to ask him how his experience compared. And of course, I shared his sorrow, the tragedies of separations and war. And we knew about the story of the Koreans who went to Uzbekistan. One of them gave a talk to us a year or two ago. I didn't realize they'd gone on to the Ukraine, and I was fascinated to hear that. But more broadly, I think his question of whether we have yet seen the end of the spillover of the Ukraine-Russian war into other parts of the world, I think that's a very, very important question, and I'm not sure we've got an answer to that. And of course, one key to that is China. I mean, China's the key player. Yeah. And you can't have any discussion about any global situation in the world now without talking about China. Yes. And I think, as you all know, the great Congress is going on now. There haven't been any very striking statements about foreign policy, except that China is going to stick to its very curious definition of territorial integrity. How that doesn't protect Ukraine, I think, is a puzzle for all of us, but it doesn't. Nevertheless, Xi Jinping has a lot of eggs on his plate. More or less, all of his policies are going wrong right now. And so I don't think he's likely to take on any kind of military adventurism or really get himself any closer to Putin. I think he's realized that the big strategic mistake that China has made over the last 30, 40 years is to rely on Russia for its understanding of Europe. Russians told him that Europe would fall apart and would not support Ukraine, and he believed it. And he's been proved comprehensively wrong. So I think that's going to take a major rethink, and I wouldn't have thought that at the moment that he's ready to take on any kind of increased involvement. whether, as Chai mischievously suggested, he is going to invite Putin to come and live in China. Well, like Idi Amin has been invited to different places. I don't know, but I think for the time being, I think China will take a back seat in all this, which is rather reassuring.
Yeah, let Heonik answer, and then I'd like to come back to you.
Heonik is not here anymore.
Oh, Heonik's gone.
Yeah,
Heonik, he sent a message
sorry.
that he had to leave.
I'm sorry.
Oh,
I didn't miss that.
Well, Alan, I wanted to ask you, because I didn't mention this, and I was hoping that either you or Hans would come back to me. I mean, if we're now talking about, you know, the war renewing itself in the spring, as I fear it will do full tilt, which I by no means take as inevitable, even necessarily probable, but if it looked as if Russia was going to lose on such a scale that not just Putin, but that the regime itself might come down, and you would have, you know, Russia swinging away from the Chinese camp and everything. Would you not think that at that point he might be willing to at least emulate the Iranians and send military equipment and this kind of thing to bolster up the Russians? Because after all, in a sense, now that Biden and the Americans have defined China as enemy number one and have cut off as much in terms of trade relations as it is possible really to do, I don't think that the Americans really, is there much more that they could do to China realistically if the Chinese supplied drones or something that they're not doing now?
Well, I think that there is in this murky world of chips a very specific thing they can do. They can hobble China's development of its new industries very severely. But on the other hand, I taking a very, very, very long view, big view. I mean, you're quite right. I'm sure that Russia and China are, as it were, like all the old Catholic nations of Europe. They're Catholics together, and they'll rise against the Protestants, so to speak. So I think that is a very strong, but on balance, one of the key planks of Xi's plans for China during the rest of his lifetime is that it would modernize, and US could very effectively hobble it.
Even more than they've decided to do already. Okay.
Yes.
Well, you see, you're telling me things which is really useful and interesting. Yeah. Good.
Fascinating conversation.
Yes. Right. Are you in touch with Hans in Beijing?
We are. Yes, we're going to see him We're going to see him for the first time. He's coming out to our cottage this weekend.
Good. I mean, he sent me a message saying, let's get in touch. And I'm so stupid. Although I typed it out, I don't know how to respond to that kind of message. Is he still on his old email, Cambridge email?
Yes, it's a curious one. It's VJJT or something like that.
Chai, I'll put you in touch, Chai.
Could you? That would be great, because I'll email Hans, because now he's gone, I think my message won't get through.
He's got a China mobile as well. So
yes, I'll send him an email. It's firstly, I'll send him an email.
Yeah, he'd love to see you.
That'd be great. We're friends in Cambridge.
Exactly. He was very pleased to know that you were going to be here. Yeah. That's great. Well, thanks.
Okay. If there's anybody else wishing to take part now, there's a chance. Otherwise, I think it's getting late for you, Chai. I think you probably want to have some dinner now.
Could I just, is Anastasia still there?
Yes, she is.
Anastasia. Yeah. Hi. Presumably, you're very much under the wing of Carolyn Humphreys, are you, in Cambridge?
She was at the department. Yes. As I said, I'm no longer at the department or at Trinity. But yes, and her husband was master of Trinity.
That's silly. Before you disappeared, as far as I was concerned, into a different world. I was just wanted to ask you. Great. Well, nice to meet you anyway. Good
to meet you too, and thank you for a discussion that kind of brought up so many things from different perspectives.
All of them sad. All of them sad, unfortunately, but still, God bless.
I mean, Cambridge is so many refugees. We're hosting a family as well, I guess you wouldn't recognize
well,
the faces.
I hope I've succeeded
Ukrainian, Russian on every
diverting
corner.
some money for refugees from a fund I control. I think I have. So I'm trying. You know, it's